There is a voice in your head, and it is reading these words, not out loud. You are not moving your lips, but there is a voice. You can hear it, in some sense that is not hearing, saying the words as your eyes pass over them. It has a quality. It might be your own voice. It might be flatter than your own voice or faster. It is doing something right now that you did not ask it to do and cannot easily make it stop doing. Whose voice is it? That question sounds like a trick, or like something a certain kind of person asks at a certain kind of party. It is not. It is one of the oldest questions there is, and the first people who could write anything down had an answer to it, a specific, structured, detailed answer that is nothing like the one you would give, and that is, in a way I am going to try to show you, closer to what the neuroscience actually finds than the answer you would give. The Sumerians and the Babylonians who inherited their world did not think a human being had one voice inside them. They thought you were crowded. They thought the space behind your eyes was populated, that there was a guide who advised you, and a god and a goddess who wanted different things, and an accuser who waited for you to slip, and that the most important voice of all, the one whose presence or absence decided whether your life went well or badly, was a voice that was not, in their account, yours. And they wrote it down, all of it, in lists, in laments, in letters, in the flat administrative prose these people used for everything, including their own interior lives. The tablets are catalogued. The translations are in academic editions with library call numbers. You can read the most important of them tonight, for free, and I am going to quote it to you before this is over, and it is going to describe a state that you have felt, or will feel, or have watched someone you love fall into, and it is going to describe it in language 4,000 years old that is more precise than the word we use for it now. Before the 7, one thing about why you have never taken this seriously. You have been taught a story about the mind, and the story is so deep in you that it does not feel like a story. It feels like simply looking. The story is that you are one person, a single, unified self, sitting behind your eyes in charge, generating your own thoughts, hearing your own voice. One mind, one owner, one continuous I running the whole operation. That story is recent. It is not human nature. It is one culture's account of human nature. And it is younger than writing. And there is a real argument, which we will come to, that it did not exist at all until a few thousand years ago, and that we can watch it being born in the texts. The people who invented the sentence, the school, the law, and the map did not hold it. They looked inward and did not see one unified self in charge. They saw a committee, and they wrote down the membership. I am going to give you the 7 voices as they describe them, and against each one I am going to put what we now know, from neuroscience, from psychology, from the strange recent discovery that a large number of human beings have no inner voice at all and did not realize the rest of us did. And I am going to be honest, every step about where the ancient text is solid and where the modern interpretation of it is contested, because one of the 7 rests on a famous and disputed theory, and I am not going to smuggle it past you as fact, but I want you to hold underneath all of it the question from the top, the voice reading these words to you right now, the one you did not start and cannot easily stop. The Sumerians would not have asked whose voice it is. They already knew it was not a simple question, and they had 7 answers, and the 7th is the one that should keep you up. Let's begin with the one they trusted. The first voice. Every person in ancient Mesopotamia had a god of their own. Not a favourite among the great gods. Not Enlil or Enki or Marduk. Those were the gods of the state, of the cities, of the cosmos, and an ordinary person had no more direct relationship with them than you have with the concept of national sovereignty. The great gods were addressed by priests in temples on behalf of everyone. A farmer did not pray to Enlil. Enlil was busy holding up the sky. What the farmer had was a personal god. His own? A small deity, often unnamed in the records or known only within a family, who belong to him the way a surname belongs to him, inherited, usually, from his father, passed down the household. The personal God was conceived, and this is the word the scholarship uses because it is the word the texts use, as a parent. A divine father or mother who attended to you specifically, who walked beside you, who took an interest in your one small life among the hundreds of thousands. And the personal God's job was to guide. This is the first voice, and it is the foundation of all the others, so I want to be precise about what it was understood to do. The personal God advised, it prompted, when you had a good idea, a genuinely good idea, the kind that arrives and feels like it comes from somewhere better than your ordinary self, that was, in the Mesopotamian account, not simply you. That was your God speaking. The good impulse, the sound plan, the moment of clarity where you suddenly knew what to do. The personal God put it there. And the language they used for this is the thing I need you to notice, because it is not metaphorical in the way we would make it metaphorical. When a Mesopotamian said his God guided him, he did not mean it the way a modern religious person means God was watching over me. A general providence, a background comfort. He meant something located and specific and close. The God was at his side. The guidance was heard, in the sense that it arrived as something given rather than something generated. It came from a source that felt, from the inside, like it was not him. Here is why that matters, and it is going to be the through line of this entire video. So let me lay it down carefully now. You have a voice that does exactly this. When you reason something through, when you talk yourself into a decision, or rehearse what you're going to say, or work a problem by narrating it silently to yourself, you are using what psychologists call inner speech, the voice in the head. An inner speech is not a vague background hum. It is a specific cognitive faculty. It is measurable, and we know a fair amount about where it came from. The best supported account comes from Lev Vygotsky, a Soviet psychologist working in the 1920s and 30s who died at 37 and whose work was suppressed for decades and then became foundational. Vygotsky watched how children develop, and he noticed something about how they talk to themselves. Very young children do not have an inner voice. What they have is outer speech. They talk out loud to themselves constantly, narrating their own play, instructing themselves aloud. Now the block goes here, now we build it up. Private speech, spoken into the air, addressed to no one. And then over a few years that private speech does not disappear. It goes underground. It gets quieter and more compressed and turns inward until it is happening silently, inside. And that, Vygotsky argued, is where the inner voice comes from. Your silent inner speech is childhood out-loud self-talk that dived beneath the surface and kept running. But here is the part that matters for the first voice. Where did the child's out-loud self-talk come from in the first place? It came from other people. It came from being talked to. The parent says, "Careful, hold it with 2 hands." The child, later, playing alone, says out loud to itself, "Careful, 2 hands." And later still, silently, in the head, the voice says "careful." And by then it feels like the child's own thought. The inner voice is, in its origin, the internalized voice of other people. It begins as the voice of a parent, guiding you, and it goes inside and it becomes what you experience as your own thinking. Sit with that against the first voice. The Mesopotamians said the guiding voice in your head is a parent, a divine parent attending to you, prompting you toward the good decision, walking at your side, its guidance arriving as something given rather than self-made. And the best developmental account we have says the guiding voice in your head is literally and by mechanism an internalized parent, the voice of the people who raised you, taken inside, become the substance of your own silent thought, and experienced from within as guidance that simply arrives. There is a number that reframes the whole first voice, and it comes from the god lists. The Mesopotamians catalogued their gods the way they catalogued everything, in lists, on tablets, for scribal training, and by the end of the 3rd millennium, the great god lists run to something on the order of 3,600 deities. 3,600, and you will notice that number because it is a shah, 60 squared, the round unit these people used for a full count, which tells you the figure means all of them, the complete set, as much as it means a literal tally. 3,600 gods. For a population that was at any given time not enormous, that is very nearly a god for every extended family. And that is more or less the point, because the personal gods are in there. The small household deities, the ones attached to a single lineage, counted alongside the great cosmic powers as if they belonged on the same list. And that juxtaposition is the thing I want you to see, because it inverts something we assume about ancient religion. We tend to imagine ancient people as small before their gods, dwarfed, prostrate, terrified of vast remote powers. And that was true of the great gods, but the personal god was the opposite. The personal god was intimate. It was scaled to you. It lived in your house, sometimes literally, in a niche, as a small figure. It was inherited like furniture. It attended to your one life, your business, your health, your specific small decisions at close range all day. The relationship was not awe, it was closer to family, with all the closeness and all the friction that word implies. You could be disappointed in your personal god. You could feel let down by it, neglected by it, and say so. Now set that beside the mechanism one more time, because the intimacy is the tell. The internalized inner voice, the one built from the people who raised you, is not experienced as a vast remote authority either. It is intimate, it is close, it is in the house of your skull, attending to your one life, commenting on your specific small decisions all day. And your relationship with it is exactly as fraught as the Mesopotamians said theirs was, with the personal god. It guides you and it disappoints you. It protects you and it neglects you. And you can be let down by it and say so. 3,600 gods, and the ones that mattered most for the texture of a daily life, were not the enormous ones on the thrones. They were the small ones at your side, close as thought, because, I would put it to you, they were thought. The intimate guiding voice, scaled to one life, living in the house. There is a fact about the language itself that I have been holding back, because it lands harder once you already have the personal god in view. It is grammatical, and it is small, and it is the kind of thing that only a linguist would notice, and only then if they were paying attention. And it may be the most direct evidence of all for what the first voice actually was. The word for God is Ilu, and the personal God in the texts very often appears not as Ilu but as Il, with a possessive ending stuck on. My God, not the God, not a God, not God in the abstract. My God, the way you would say, my hand, my father, my name. The personal deity is grammatically possessed. It is spoken of as a belonging. And you see the same construction across the board. A person's God and a person's goddess referred to with the possessive again and again in laments, in letters, in the standard formula. My God has forsaken me. My goddess keeps at a distance. The possessive is not incidental. It is how the relationship was named. The god was, grammatically and conceptually, yours, Bakhtiar, an attached, owned personal possession, as intimate as a body part. Now sit with the strangeness of that, because it runs in two directions at once, and both of them are true. On one hand, the god is mine, possessed, owned mine, as close and as much a part of me as my own hand. On the other hand, it is a god, another, a separate being, something that can act on its own, guide me, judge me, and catastrophically leave. It is simultaneously the most intimate thing I have, and a separate agent with its own will, mine and not me, owned and other. That is not a confusion. That is a precise description of the inner voice, and the grammar nails it better than our vocabulary does. Because think about how you actually experience your own thinking voice. It is yours. Nothing is more yours. Nothing is more intimate. It is closer to you than anything in the world. And yet it is also not quite you. It talks to you. It surprises you. It says things you did not decide to say. It turns on you. It goes quiet when you need it. It acts from the inside, like a separate party. Mine and not me. That is the exact double nature of inner speech, and English has no clean way to say it. We are stuck insisting either that the voice is fully us, or that we are hearing things, with nothing in between. Akkadian had the in-between, built into the grammar. My God, a thing that is wholly mine, and simultaneously a separate agent who guides and leaves and acts. They conjugated the exact paradox that the inner voice presents and that we cannot comfortably name. The possession that is also a person, the belonging that has a will, the most intimate thing you own that is nonetheless not you. They put a god in every household because there was, in every household skull, a voice that behaved exactly like one. They said the guide was a divine parent who walked beside you and put good sense in your mind. We say the guide is your parents, walking beside you long after they're gone, put permanently in your mind and speaking in your own silent voice. They located it outside and called it a god. We locate it inside and call it development. But the structure of the claim, that the guiding voice is a parent, internalized, experienced as counsel, is the same claim. And there is a deeper root under the first voice, in the language itself, that ties the guiding voice to the very stuff a human being was thought to be made of. The Akkadian word for reason, for intelligence, for the planning mind is temu. It is the faculty of forming an intention and directing yourself toward it, the very thing the guiding voice does. And in the Mesopotamian account of how humans were made, temu is not something that grew in us. It is something that was put in us. In the creation story, the gods slaughter one of their own, a god who possessed temu, and mix his flesh and blood into clay. And it is specifically his temu, the divine intelligence, that becomes the thinking part of the human being. The reasoning faculty in you, in their account, is literally divine material, a piece of a god installed. So follow what that means for the first voice. The guiding intelligence, the part of you that plans, that reasons, that arrives at the good decision, was, in the Mesopotamian understanding, never a human product to begin with. It was God stuff mixed in at manufacture. Which is why the guidance feels given rather than made, because in their account it was. The clear thought arrives from the divine component, the part that was never yours, the part that came from outside the human and was mixed into the clay to make the clay able to think at all. You do not have to believe a god was killed to make you, but hold the structure of the claim against your own experience one more time. The reasoning that produces your best thinking does not feel like something you built by effort, brick by brick. It feels like something that operates in you, a faculty you have, not a thing you made, that hands you conclusions you then recognize as good. They accounted for that feeling by saying the faculty is not of human origin. It was divine and installed, and that is why it works on its own and delivers to you rather than being laboriously worked by you. We account for the same feeling by saying the reasoning is subpersonal, automatic, running below the self that receives its outputs, divine material or automatic machinery. Either way, not made by the you that it serves, and experienced correctly as given. There is a class of document that makes this concrete, and it is one of the strangest and most human things to survive from the ancient world. People wrote letters to their personal gods, not prayers exactly, letters, composed in the exact format of an ordinary piece of Mesopotamian correspondence, the kind a man would send to his business partner or his brother with the standard opening formula, to so-and-so, Thus says so-and-so. Except the addressee is not a business partner. The addressee is the writer's own personal God, and the letter is a complaint. And the complaints are astonishingly ordinary. They are not cosmic. A man writes to his God to ask why he is suffering, why business has gone bad, why he is sick, why the God has not been holding up the God's end of the arrangement. Because it was understood as an arrangement, an actual reciprocal relationship with obligations on both sides. You honored your God, you made your offerings, you kept the relationship warm, and in return, the God guided you, protected you, interceded for you with the greater powers. And when the protection failed, you were within your rights to write a letter and say so. One of these texts has a man essentially asking his God, "What did I do? Tell me the offense so I can fix it." Because the silence, not knowing why the guidance had stopped, was the unbearable part. Sit with what that implies about the interior life of these people. The relationship with the personal God was close enough, and concrete enough, and conversational enough, that when it broke down, the natural thing to do was to write it a letter in the same format you would use for a person, and hope for a reply. The God was an interlocutor, someone you were in ongoing dialogue with, someone whose voice you were used to, and whose silence you noticed the way you would notice a friend who had stopped answering. Now hold that against the mechanism from a moment ago, the inner voice as internalized other, the voice of the parent taken inside, and become your own silent counsel. If the guiding voice in your head is, at bottom, a relationship, an internalized other that you're in ongoing dialogue with, then writing that other a letter when it goes quiet is not primitive at all. It is an exact externalization of what the relationship already was. They took the inner interlocutor and put it back outside, on a tablet, and addressed it, because that is what it had always been, someone you talk to and who talks back inside. We do a version of the same thing and do not notice. We rehearse arguments with people who are not in the room. We ask ourselves what a dead parent would say. We conduct entire conversations silently with an internalized other who answers in a voice we know. The Mesopotamian just did it on clay and addressed the other by name and called it a god. And they were right about something we find embarrassing to admit. It does not feel like you. The good idea arrives. You did not watch yourself build it. It is there, finished, and it feels given. And when the guidance did not come on its own, they went looking for it. And how they went looking tells you they experienced guidance as something received rather than produced. If the voice was silent, if you faced a decision and no clear guidance arrived, you did not simply sit and reason it out. That option existed, of course. These were not stupid people, and they deliberated like anyone. But when it mattered, the characteristic Mesopotamian move was to go somewhere and solicit a message. To put yourself in a position to receive guidance from outside. One route was the dream. There was a practice, it runs across the ancient world, but Mesopotamia had it early and formally, of dream incubation. You went to a temple, you performed the rites and you slept there, deliberately, in the sacred space, in order to receive a dream. A message, guidance delivered in the night from a source that was not your waking self. You did not generate the answer. You created the conditions for the answer to arrive, and then you slept, and you received what came. Another route was the vast apparatus of divination, the reading of omens, of the liver of a sacrificed animal, of the movements of the sky, of oil on water, of smoke. Enormous intellectual labour went into this. It was arguably the central science of Mesopotamian civilization, and the god most associated with it. Shamash, the sun, who saw everything, was called the Lord of Judgment and of the Oracle. And the logic of all of it is the same logic as the dream and the same logic as the personal God. The guidance you need is not something you construct. It is something that exists out there in the structure of the world, waiting to be read. You do not decide. You find out. You put the question to a source outside yourself, and you receive the answer. Here is why that matters, and it closes the loop on the first voice. We do a version of this and we have simply stopped noticing it is the same move. Sleep on it. That is dream incubation with the temple removed. We tell each other with complete sincerity that the way to solve a hard problem is to stop working on it, go to sleep, and let the answer arrive, and it does notoriously. People wake with the solution that would not come while they were consciously grinding at it. The answer was assembled in the night by a process the waking self had no access to, and delivered on waking, complete. That is not a metaphor for what the Mesopotamians did. It is the same phenomenon with the theology stripped off, and the incubation case makes the seventh voice's point early. So hold it. The solution that arrives after sleep was produced by you. It is your brain that did it, obviously, not a god in a temple. And it arrived exactly as they said guidance arrives, from a source the conscious self cannot see, assembled without your involvement, delivered finished, experienced as given. They built a temple around that experience. We build a proverb around it. But the experience is identical, and it is the experience of your best thinking coming from somewhere you are not. They had a word for who gave it, we do not. The second voice. The second voice. The first voice was defined by its presence. The second is defined by what happens when it goes, because a personal God could leave. This is the hinge of the entire Mesopotamian understanding of suffering, and it is completely alien to the way we think. And once you understand it, you cannot read their literature any other way. To a Mesopotamian, misfortune was not primarily a matter of bad luck, or bad decisions, or the indifferent grinding of the world. Misfortune was abandonment. When things went wrong, when you got sick, when your business failed, when your children died, when the black mood descended and would not lift, the explanation was that your personal God had withdrawn. The guide had stopped guiding. The voice at your side had gone quiet and left you exposed. And they wrote about that experience. They wrote about it more powerfully than about almost anything else, because it was the worst thing that could happen to a person. And one of the things they wrote is among the great documents of human interiority. And I am going to read you the opening now. The text is called Ludlul Bel Nemeki. It is usually translated, I will praise the Lord of wisdom, though the scholars will tell you wisdom is slightly wrong, and it means something closer to skill, or the ability to survive misfortune. It is a long poem on 4 tablets, and it is the first-person account of a man, a wealthy, important man named Shubshi-Meshre Shakan, whose entire life collapses. He loses his position, his health, his friends, his standing, everything, for no reason he can identify. It is sometimes called the Babylonian Job, and it is older than Job, and it is asking the same question Job asks, why is this happening to a person who did nothing wrong? Here is how it begins, the first readable lines of the first tablet. My God has forsaken me and disappeared. My goddess has failed me and keeps at a distance. The good angel who walked beside me has departed. Stop on that third line. The good angel who walked beside me has departed. The one who walked beside me. The guide. The first voice. The presence at the shoulder that advised and prompted and protected, gone. Withdrawn to a distance. And the man is left for the length of this poem in a state he describes with a precision that is genuinely hard to bear. He cannot sleep, or he sleeps, and has terrors. He is sick in every part of his body. His friends have turned on him. He prays and gets no answer. He looks for the God at his side, and the side is empty. Here is why that matters. Read that opening to a psychiatrist without telling them how old it is, and they will give you a diagnosis. The loss of pleasure and function. the disturbed sleep, the physical symptoms with no physical cause, the conviction of having been abandoned, the prayers into silence, the sense that some presence that used to be there, that used to make life feel supported and guided, has withdrawn and left a void where it was. That is a clinical description of severe depression, written 4,000 years ago, and it is better than the word we use. Because look at what our word does. We say depression, press down. It is a spatial metaphor about weight, and it is fine, but it says nothing about the texture of the thing, the specific quality that people who have been there report over and over. Not sadness exactly, but absence, emptiness. The sense that something that used to be present is gone. People in severe depression very frequently describe it not as a feeling that has arrived, but as a presence that has departed. The colour drained out, the voice that used to encourage gone silent. The self that used to be there, somehow vacated. The Mesopotamians built that exact observation into their language for it. The affliction is not a thing that comes. It is a presence that leaves. The good angel who walked beside me has departed. They located the interior support that vanishes in depression, gave it a name, and described its withdrawal in a line that lands harder than anything in the DSM. I want to stay inside Ludlul a little longer because it is not a short cry of pain. It is a long, structured descent, and the structure is the part that will be familiar to anyone who has been there. The sufferer, Shubshi Meshre Shakan, begins as a man who had everything: status, wealth, a position at court, and it is stripped from him in stages, and he narrates each stage, and the narration is clinical in its attention to how the world curdles. First, the social collapse. The people around him turn. His friends will not speak to him. His acquaintances cross to avoid him. The ones who flattered him now slander him. He has become, without understanding how, a person others move away from. Anyone who has been seriously depressed or seriously ill knows this exact phenomenon. The way misfortune makes you radioactive, the way people withdraw from suffering as if it were contagious, the way you find yourself alone at precisely the moment you most need not to be. Then the body. He catalogues his symptoms across the length of a tablet, and it is a genuine catalogue. His head, his eyes, his limbs, his chest, each part failing in its own way, a full-body affliction that the physicians and the exorcists cannot diagnose or lift. They come, and they try, and they fail, and he lists their failure. And underneath both, the social ruin and the physical collapse, is the thing that actually breaks him, which is not either of those. It is the silence. He has done everything right. He has been, by his own account, scrupulously devout. He prayed, he sacrificed, he kept the festivals, he taught his people to do the same, and it brought him nothing. The God does not answer. And this produces in him not just grief, but a kind of vertigo, a collapse of the whole framework by which he understood the world. Because if devotion does not protect you, then the rules are not the rules, and anyone can fall for no reason, and there is no safe conduct through life at all. That is the passage that makes people call it the Babylonian Job, and it predates Job, and it is asking the harder version of Job's question. Not, why do the wicked prosper, but why does righteousness not protect me? Why the good angel departs from a man who did everything to keep it? And the reason I am dwelling on it is that the modern parallel is not just this describes depression. It is more specific and more uncomfortable than that. Ludlul describes the particular cruelty of depression that the sufferer cannot argue their way out of, the conviction that they must have done something to deserve this, combined with the inability to find what. The self-interrogation that finds no crime and therefore never ends. The certainty of guilt without the content of guilt. That is not a general description of feeling sad. That is a precise description of the cognitive engine of depression and anxiety. The search for the reason, the failure to find it, and the turning of that failure into more evidence against the self. 4,000 years ago, A man wrote down that engine, running in the first person, and left it for you. And there is a neurological layer here that I want to add carefully, because it is real and I do not want to overstate it. The inner voice, the guiding, narrating inner speech from the first segment is not constant, and it changes in mood disorders. In depression, the content of inner speech is well known to turn. It becomes harsh, self-critical, repetitive, a voice that attacks rather than guides. But there is also, for many people, a change in its presence, a flattening, a silence, a sense that the internal narrator that used to accompany them and help them has gone quiet or gone hostile. The supportive inner voice withdraws, and what is left is either silence or an accuser. And we will come to the accuser. But hold the shape of the second voice. The first voice is a guide that walks beside you. The second voice is the same voice, leaving, and the Mesopotamians understood, 4,000 years before we did, that the departure of the internal guide is not sadness. It is a specific and nameable catastrophe, and it has a texture, and the texture is absence. They did not think you got depressed. They thought you got left, and I am not sure they were wrong about which description is truer to the thing. The oldest literature does not only describe the voice leaving, it describes the voice arriving. And one of the most moving instances is in the oldest long story we have, and it is about grief. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero has a companion, Enkidu, a wild man made by the gods, who becomes the friend Gilgamesh loves more than anyone. And the gods decide Enkidu must die, as punishment, and before he dies, he has dreams. And the dreams are not vague, they are messages, the gods delivering to Enkidu in sleep. The news of his own coming death, and a vision of the underworld he is about to enter. He wakes and reports them to Gilgamesh, and they are true, and he dies. Throughout the epic, this is simply how important knowledge arrives. In dreams that are understood as sendings, messages from outside delivered into the mind of a sleeping person who did not author them and receives them as given. Gilgamesh himself has the great dreams. Before Enkidu even appears, Gilgamesh dreams of him, dreams of a companion coming, and takes the dreams to his mother to be interpreted, because the dream is a message and messages require reading. The characters do not treat their dreams as their own minds talking to themselves. They treat them as communications, arriving from outside the self, bearing information the self did not have, needing an interpreter the way a letter in a foreign hand needs a translator. And here is why that belongs with the second voice, the departing voice. We have already seen that the guidance which arrives in sleep, the sleep on it phenomenon, the solution assembled overnight and delivered on waking, is real and is your own brain, working below awareness and handing up a finished result. The Mesopotamians experienced that same arrival and called it ascending from the gods. And notice the emotional truth they preserved that we have lost. They treated the arrival of knowledge. You did not author with the appropriate awe. A dream that told you something true was a momentous thing, an intrusion of the beyond into the self, to be recorded and interpreted and taken with total seriousness. We get the same deliveries, the overnight solution, the sudden knowing, the thing you did not work out but simply found yourself understanding. And we barely notice them, because our story says they are just us, our own minds, nothing to see. We have flattened the astonishment out of the most astonishing thing the mind does, which is to hand you, from somewhere you cannot see, knowledge you did not build. Gilgamesh took his dreams to his mother to be read. When did you last treat a thought that arrived from nowhere as anything other than your own unremarkable property? The third voice. Go back to the opening of Ludlul and read it again, because there is a detail in it I passed over. And the detail is the third voice. My God has forsaken me and disappeared. My goddess has failed me and keeps at a distance. Two of them, not one, a god and a goddess. And this is not a flourish, not poetic doubling for emphasis, it is doctrine. A person did not have a personal god. A person had a personal god and a personal goddess, and they were distinct, and they did different things. The scholarship on this is clear and consistent. Alongside the personal god, the Ilu, a Mesopotamian had a personal goddess, the Ishtaru, and the pairing appears constantly in exactly the parallel structure you just heard. The god and the goddess named together doing complementary work. And when you look at what work each one does, a structure emerges that is genuinely striking. The god tends to be associated with the ordering functions, guidance, judgment, the setting of a path, the standard you are held to. The goddess tends to be associated with the protective and merciful functions, intercession, compassion, the softening of judgment, the voice that pleads on your behalf. In the Theodicy, a related wisdom text, the sufferer cries out for both. May the god who has thrown me off give help. May the goddess who has abandoned me show mercy. Two voices, one that sets the standard and can throw you off, one that shows mercy and can take you back. You are not in this account in dialogue with a single inner authority. You are in dialogue with at least two, and they are not the same, and they can disagree, and part of what it is to be a person is the ongoing negotiation between them. Here is why that matters. For a long time, the folk model of inner speech, and even a lot of the early psychology, treated it as a monologue. One voice, you narrating to yourself, a single stream of silent language running through the head. That is not what the research finds. When psychologists actually sample inner speech, and there are careful methods for this now, the most rigorous being a technique called descriptive experience sampling, where people carry a beeper that goes off at random moments, and they immediately record exactly what was in their experience at the instant before the beep. One of the most robust findings is that inner speech is frequently dialogic. It is not one voice talking, it is a conversation. People report their inner experience as an exchange, a back and forth between positions, between perspectives, sometimes between what are experienced as different voices with different attitudes. Charles Fernyhough, who has done as much as anyone to bring rigour to this field, makes the dialogic quality central. Drawing on Vygotsky again, if the inner voice is internalised conversation, internalised from the back and forth between a child and other people, then it should carry the structure of conversation inside. It should have turns. It should have more than one part, and it does. When you deliberate, you are not issuing a monologue, you are running a dialogue, putting a position, and then answering it, taking one side and then the other. The mind talks to itself the way two people talk, and often the parts have characters. One is harder, one is softer. One holds you to the standard. One makes the case for mercy. One says you should have known better. One says you did what you could. People who pay attention to their inner speech recognize this immediately. There is a prosecutor in there, and there is a defender in there, and they are not the same voice, and the life of the mind is substantially the argument between them. I want to give you the method behind this, because inner speech is dialogic could sound like an armchair claim, and it is not. It is the result of people working very hard to catch the inner voice in the act, and the story of how they did it matters. The problem with studying inner speech is obvious the moment you try. The instrument and the object are the same thing. You want to know what your inner experience is like, so you introspect. But the act of introspecting changes the experience you're trying to observe. The moment you turn your attention to your inner voice to see what it is doing, it starts performing for you. You get a report, but the report is contaminated by the reporting. A psychologist named Russell Hurlburt spent decades building a method to get around this, and it is ingenious. It is called descriptive experience sampling. You give a person a beeper, a small device that emits a tone at random intervals through the day. They wear it while they go about ordinary life, and the instruction is, At the exact moment the beep sounds, you freeze the contents of your experience, whatever was in your awareness in the last undisturbed instant before the beep, and you note it down. Then later, an interviewer questions you about it in detail, carefully, trying to strip away your assumptions and get at what was actually there. The beep is the trick. It catches experience before you have turned your attention to it. It samples the inner life in its natural state at a random moment, rather than the performed version you produce when you sit down to introspect on purpose. And the findings are humbling because they demolish a lot of what people confidently assume about their own heads. The first finding is that people are wrong about their own inner experience, routinely, confidently wrong. Many people who are certain they think in words all the time in a constant stream turn out, when actually sampled, to have far less inner speech than they believed, and long stretches of experience with no words in them at all. The constant inner monologue that people report is, for many of them, partly a story they tell about their minds rather than an accurate observation of them. The second finding is the one that matters here. When inner speech is present at the beep, it is frequently not a monologue. It has structure. It has more than one voice. People catch themselves mid-dialogue, answering a question they pose to themselves, taking a side against another side, running an exchange rather than a broadcast. Charles Fernyhough built on exactly this. His argument, grounded in Vygotsky and tested against the sampling data, is that inner speech carries the structure of the conversations it was internalized from. It comes in more than one voice because it was built out of dialogue, out of the back and forth between the child and other people, and it kept the back and forth when it went inside. He distinguishes a compressed, condensed form of inner speech, a kind of shorthand the mind uses at speed, from an expanded form that is fully articulated and fully dialogic, where distinct positions with distinct characters take turns. That is the third voice, arrived at from the other direction. The Mesopotamians looked inward and reported two divine interlocutors, a god and a goddess, complementary and sometimes opposed. Hurlbert's beeper and Fernyhough's analysis look inward with instruments and report multiple voices, in dialogue, often opposed. Same finding. One route runs through theology and one runs through a random tone generator, and they arrive at the same place. The inner life is a conversation, and the conversation has sides. There is a piece of history that belongs here, and it is one of the strangest facts about the human mind, because it shows that even the voice reading these words, the thing I opened with, the thing that feels most basic and most universal, is not fixed. It has a history. It was, in a sense, invented. For most of the history of writing, people did not read silently. They read aloud. Always, or nearly always. Reading meant moving your lips and making sound, even when you were alone, even when no one was there to hear. To read was to voice. The idea of running your eyes over a text and taking it in silently, with only an inner voice sounding the words, was rare enough that when people encountered someone doing it, they remarked on it as something worth remarking. The most famous instance is Augustine in the Confessions, describing his teacher Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan, in the 4th century. Augustine watches Ambrose read, and he is genuinely struck by the fact that Ambrose reads without moving his lips. His eyes move down the page and he takes in the meaning, and he makes no sound. Augustine turns it over, tries to explain it. Maybe the bishop is protecting his voice. Maybe he does not want to be drawn into discussion by anyone overhearing, because a man reading in total silence was strange enough to require an explanation. Scholars argue about how to read that passage, and about how absolute the shift really was. Silent reading was not literally unknown in the ancient world, and the transition was gradual and uneven. But the direction is not seriously in doubt. Silent reading, the thing you're doing right now, the pure inner voice reading with no sound at all, went from rare and remarkable to universal and invisible over the long history of literacy. The internal voice that sounds the words as you read. That is not a fixed feature of the human being. It is something that came to the foreground, historically, as reading moved inside. And that is the deepest possible version of the point this whole video is circling. Even the voice reading these words, the one I used to open, the one that feels like the bedrock of your inner life, is not a fixed and timeless part of you. It is a thing that the mind can do or not do, that history foregrounded, that some people barely have, that runs on machinery you did not build. You experience it as simply what reading is. But there were centuries of readers who did not have it running the way you have it running right now, and there are people alive today for whom it barely runs at all, and it took a scanner to show that when it runs, it partly borrows the machinery of hearing an actual voice. You did not decide to read this in a voice. The voice simply started when your eyes hit the first line. Whose instruction was that? The Mesopotamians drew exactly that structure and put God's names on it. The God who sets the standard and can throw you off. The goddess who intercedes and shows mercy. The hard voice and the soft voice, personified, paired in permanent complementary tension, so that to be a person is to live in the space between the one who judges you and the one who forgives you. We rediscovered the dialogue. We rediscovered that the inner voice is really inner voices, plural in conversation, often with opposed characters. We called it dialogic inner speech, and we published it in the 2010s. They called it your God and your Goddess, and they wrote it into the first line of their greatest poem about suffering, and the line survived 4,000 years so that it could describe exactly the two-sided argument that is running in your head as you listen to this. The fourth voice, not every voice in the Mesopotamian head was on your side. The first three were, in their way, benevolent, the guide that could leave, the two-sided counsel of God and Goddess. But the Mesopotamian world was crowded with other presences, and some of them were waiting for you to fail. And the one I want to give you is a specific figure, because the word is exact and the modern parallel is exact, and together they are unsettling. The word is rabisu. It comes from a verb meaning to lie in wait, to crouch, to lurk, the way a predator waits at a watering hole. And a rabisu is a lurking thing, a demon that waits. In some contexts, the word is even used for a kind of divine bailiff or prosecutor, an official presence that watches you, notes what you do, and waits at the threshold. It could lurk at a doorway. It could lie in wait in the dark places. And it could lurk in a person. It waited for the lapse, the sin, the moment of weakness, the open door, and then it entered. And this connects to the deepest structure of how these people understood misfortune, which I touched on with the second voice, but need to complete now. When the personal God withdrew, when the good angel departed, why did it happen? What made a God leave? Sin, offence, transgression, often unknown. Often, the Mesopotamian lived with a constant, low-grade dread of having offended, without knowing how some god or power, and thereby having driven away their protector and opened the door to the lurking things. Ludlul is full of this. The sufferer ransacks his own memory for the offence that must explain his abandonment and cannot find it, and is tormented precisely by not being able to find it. He knows he must have sinned, because look at his suffering, but he cannot locate the sin, and so he is left accusing himself endlessly of a crime he cannot name. That is the fourth voice, the internal accuser, the presence that watches, waits, catalogues your failures, and speaks up at the moment of weakness to tell you that you are guilty, and that keeps speaking and cannot be satisfied and does not need to know the specific charge to deliver the verdict. Here is why that matters. You have one of these, almost everyone does. It has a name in the clinical and popular literature now, the inner critic, and it is one of the most studied and most destructive features of the human interior. It is the voice that says, you are not good enough. It is the voice that replays the embarrassing thing you did and makes you wince years later, at a memory no one else remembers. It is the voice that waits for you to fail, and then says, "I knew it." In its severe forms, it is central to depression, to anxiety, to eating disorders, to the whole family of conditions where a person turns on themselves. The harsh, self-critical inner voice is not a metaphor. It is a measurable pattern of inner speech, and it is a target of actual treatment. A great deal of modern therapy is, in essence, teaching people to hear the accuser as a voice rather than as the truth, and to answer it. And there is a specific phenomenon that maps onto the rabbis almost exactly, and it is the one that would have frightened a Mesopotamian most, because they would have recognized it instantly. The intrusive thought. You are standing on a train platform, and a thought arrives, unbidden, in your own inner voice. Step forward. You are holding your child, and a thought arrives. Drop them. You are in a quiet room, a place of safety, and something in you produces an image or a sentence that is violent or obscene or blasphemous or cruel, something you do not want, did not summon, and are horrified by. This is nearly universal. The great majority of people have intrusive thoughts. They arrive in your own inner voice, wearing the costume of your own thought, and they say things you would never choose to say. For most people, they pass. But for some, in obsessive-compulsive disorder above all, they lurk and return and cannot be driven out. The defining agony of OCD is precisely a thought that lies in wait, enters at the moment of vulnerability, delivers an accusation or a horror, and will not leave. The sufferer knows the thought is not them, does not represent them, is the opposite of what they want, and cannot stop it arriving, and is tormented exactly like the sufferer in Ludlul, by an accuser they cannot answer, and a guilt they cannot discharge. The Mesopotamians did not have the word intrusive thought. They had a word for a thing that lurks, waits for your weakness, enters through the open door, and accuses. They called it a demon, and they located it, correctly, at the threshold of the mind, and they understood, this is the part we forget, that it was not the same as you. It was a separate presence, a lurker, something that got in. The Mesopotamians did not only imagine the presences that threatened them, they imagined the ones that guarded them, and the arrangement they pictured is worth having, because it is the whole model of the mind in a single image. You have seen the lamassu, even if you do not know the name, the colossal winged bulls with human faces and long braided beards that stood at the gates of Assyrian palaces, the ones in the British Museum and the Louvre and the Met, the ones so large you feel them before you reach them. Those are lamassu, and a lamassu at that scale, in stone at a palace gate, is a guardian, a protective spirit stationed at the threshold to keep hostile powers out. But the lamassu was not only a monument. In the personal sphere, the lamassu and its male counterpart the shaidu were protective spirits attached to an individual. You had one, it stood with you, and the standard way of picturing it was spatial and specific. Your protective spirits flanked you, one on each side, walking with you, warding the approaches, ice walking, while, in the darker reading, the lurking things waited for a gap. So assemble the full Mesopotamian picture of a protected person, because they were quite precise about the geometry of it. At your side, the personal god guiding, flanking you, the shaidu and the lamassu warding, and at the threshold, kept out so long as the arrangement held, the rabassu lurking, waiting for the protection to lapse. A person in good standing was, in the fullest sense, accompanied, surrounded, escorted through the world by a small retinue of presences, each with a station and a job, and the loss of any of them left a gap where something worse could enter. Here is why that matters beyond the vividness of it. That is a remarkably accurate map of a mind in good order versus a mind in trouble. A well-functioning inner life does feel accompanied. The supportive inner voice is present. The self-critical voice is kept in proportion. The protective habits of thought, the ones that talk you down, that reassure, that maintain your sense that you're basically all right, are doing their work at the edges, warding off the intrusions. And you move through the day feeling, without ever putting it this way, escorted by your own mind rather than exposed to it. And when a mind goes into trouble, it goes into trouble in exactly the shape the Mesopotamians drew. The supportive voice withdraws, the god departs, the protective habits fail, the flanking guardian step back, and into the gap comes the lurker, the intrusive thought, the catastrophic spiral, the accusation that will not stop. The geometry of mental collapse in the clinical literature really is a geometry of withdrawal and intrusion. The good voices going quiet, the bad ones getting in. The Mesopotamians drew that map 4,000 years ago, populated it with gods and demons, and got the topology right. Protection at the sides, threat at the threshold, and catastrophe when the escort withdraws and the gap opens. They did not think a troubled mind was chemically imbalanced. They thought it was unaccompanied, and if you have ever been in that state, you know which description feels truer from the inside. We have spent the last century slowly, expensively rediscovering that the healthy way to handle the accuser is exactly that. To understand that it is not you, that the intrusive thought is not your intention, that the inner critic is a voice, not a verdict. Modern therapy works when it works, largely by teaching people to externalize these voices, to stop hearing them as the authentic self, and start hearing them as something that arrived from outside the part of you that chooses. The Mesopotamians did not just fear the lurker, they developed an entire technology for dealing with it, and the technology tells you something precise about how they understood the threat. There was a class of ritual called namburbi. The word means roughly, its undoing, the release of it. And a namburbi was a procedure you performed when a sign had appeared that something bad was coming, an omen, a portent, a lurking threat that had announced itself, but not yet struck. The ritual was designed to undo the evil before it arrived, to cancel the approaching thing, to release you from the grip of a threat that was still, at that moment, only lurking. And alongside the namburbi, there was a whole professional apparatus. The ashipu, the exorcist, the specialist you called when the lurking thing had gotten in, when a person was afflicted, tormented, seized by something that would not leave. The ashipu diagnosed which presence had entered and performed the procedure to expel it, and the procedures survive, in detail, on tablets. The words to say, the substances to use, the actions to perform, to get the intruder out of the person. Notice the shape of the whole enterprise, because it's not what a modern person expects from ancient superstition. It is not fatalistic. It is not, the gods have decided and you must suffer. It is intensely practical, and it is built entirely on a single assumption, that the tormenting presence is not you, is not permanent, and can be removed. The lurker got in. The lurker can be got out. There is a procedure. Here is why that matters. That is structurally exactly what modern therapy for intrusive thought does, and it is the opposite of what an untreated sufferer does on their own. The person tormented by an intrusive thought, the OCD sufferer above all, makes one catastrophic error, and it is the error the whole condition feeds on. They take the thought as theirs. They think, I had this monstrous thought, therefore something is monstrous in me. The thought about harming the child means I might harm the child. The thought is evidence about the self, and that fusion, the treating of the intrusive thought as a true product and sign of the self, is precisely the engine that gives the thought its power and makes it return. And the treatment, the thing that actually works, is to break that fusion, to teach the sufferer that the thought is not them, that it arrived, that it is noise, that having it is not the same as being it or wanting it or intending it, that it is a lurker, a thing that got in, that can be observed without being obeyed, and that loses its power precisely when you stop treating it as a message from the self and start treating it as an intruder to be let pass. The Mesopotamians started from that premise as their default. Their entire apparatus, the Namburbi, the exorcist, the diagnosis of which presence had entered, is built on the assumption the intrusive thought sufferer has to be painstakingly retaught. It is not you, it got in, it can be got out. They externalized the tormenting thought as a matter of course, because their whole model of the mind already had a category for hostile presence that is not the self. We spent the 20th century building that category back up from scratch, in the clinic, one patient at a time, because our model of the mind, one unified self, all thoughts mine, had no room in it for a thought that arrives from outside the self, and so it left sufferers with nowhere to put the horror except onto themselves. They had somewhere to put it. That is not nothing. On this one point, the demon-haunted model was kinder and more accurate than the tidy one that replaced it. There is a detail about the guardian spirits that deserves its own moment, because it closes the loop between the outside and the inside in a way the Mesopotamians would have found obvious, and we have forgotten how to see. The Lamassu and the Shidu, the protective spirits that flanked a person, were not only personal, they were also the great winged bulls at the palace gates, yes. But the word Shidu has a range that is worth sitting with. It could mean a protective spirit. It could also, in some uses, shade towards something closer to a person's vital force, their life spirit, the animating power that kept them going and kept them themselves. The guardian at your side and the vitality inside you were not always cleanly separable ideas. The thing that protected you and the thing that animated you blurred into each other. That blur is not sloppiness. It is the same insight the whole video keeps arriving at, stated in the vocabulary of spirits instead of the vocabulary of neuroscience. The protective presence and the animating self are hard to separate because, from the inside, they are not clearly separate. The voice that guides you and the you that is guided, the force that protects you and the force that is you, the parent taken inside and the self it became. These do not come apart along a clean seam, and the Mesopotamians, who looked hard, declined to pretend they did. They let the categories blur exactly where the categories actually blur. We have inherited a much tidier picture. The self here, its faculties there, all owned, all labelled, all under one management, and the tidiness is the error. The Mesopotamian mess, the overlapping spirits and forces and voices, with no clean boundary between the protector and the protected, the guide and the guided, the mine and the not mine. That mess is a better map of the thing than the tidy modern diagram, because the thing itself is a mess. There is no clean seam in there. Anyone who has looked knows there is no clean seam. There is a voice on this list that I have not named directly, and it is the one that gives all the others their teeth, and it is the voice of the will. Go back to the Rabisu, the lurker, and to the whole apparatus of sin and offence. The reason the Mesopotamian dreaded the lurker is that a person could be made to do things. The demon that entered, the god that withdrew, the omen that bound you. These were not just sources of suffering, they were sources of action. Something could get into you and move you. Your hand could be turned. Your course could be seized. The self was not, in this account, the sole author of its own conduct, any more than it was the sole author of its own thoughts. There were other agencies that could take the wheel. We find that primitive. We believe in the will. We believe that behind each of our voluntary actions there is an I that decided it, freely, and issued the command, and that this deciding self is the true author of what the body does. And this is the place where the modern science is most uncomfortable, so I'm going to be careful and honest about exactly how uncomfortable. Starting in the 1980s, the physiologist Benjamin Libet ran a series of famous experiments on the timing of voluntary action. He asked people to make a simple free movement, flex the wrist whenever they felt like it, and to note the exact moment they became consciously aware of the decision to move, using a special clock. And he measured brain activity throughout. And what he found, and what has been argued about ferociously ever since, is that the brain activity that precedes the movement, the readiness potential, the ramp up toward action, begins before the person reports being consciously aware of having decided. The preparation to act appears to start before the conscious decision to act shows up in awareness. Now, I have to be as careful here as I was with Jane's because this result is contested and it has been overinterpreted relentlessly, and I am not going to hand you the sensational version. The interpretation is genuinely disputed. Some argue the readiness potential is not a decision at all, but background neural noise. Some argue Libet's timing method is unreliable. Some argue the whole setup, an arbitrary, meaningless flick of the wrist, tells you nothing about real, considered choices. Later work has complicated the picture in every direction. This does not prove there is no free will, and serious people hold that it shows much less than the headlines claimed. I want that on the record. But strip it down to the part that is not in dispute, because the modest version is enough, and it is the version that matters here. At minimum, a great deal of the processing that produces your actions happens before and beneath conscious awareness. The decision surfaces into consciousness as something that feels freely and consciously authored. But a large part of its assembly happened out of sight, in the same backstage region that produces your thoughts and fetches your words and delivers your overnight solutions. The feeling of "I decided this" consciously just now is, at least in part, a story the mind tells about an action that was already underway. The conscious will, like the inner voice, is downstream, a display of a decision, not always the maker of it, which is exactly, structurally, what the Mesopotamians reported. They did not experience the will as a sovereign inner I issuing free commands from a throne. They experienced conduct as something that could arrive from outside the conscious self, prompted by a god, seized by a demon, bound by an omen. And they built their whole moral and ritual world around the fact that you are not the unchallenged author of what you do. They put gods and demons in the seat where we put the conscious will. And the modern finding, in its careful and modest form, is that the seat is not as reliably occupied by the conscious I as we insist it is. Something moves you before you know you have decided to move. They said the will could be seized. We say the will is, in part, a narration laid over machinery that was already running. Neither account puts the conscious self in sole command. Only ours pretends it does. The Mesopotamians started there. They never made the mistake of thinking the accuser was the self. They knew it was a rabisu, a thing that lurks and enters. They were, on this specific point, ahead of where most people listening to this have been taught to be, the fifth voice. This is the contested one, and I am going to tell you so the whole way through. Everything I have given you so far rests on solid ground, on texts that say what I have said they say, and on scholarship that is not seriously in dispute. The personal god, the goddess, the departure in Ludlul, the lurking Rabisu, all of that is mainstream Assyriology. You could take it to any specialist and they would recognize it. The fifth voice is different. The fifth voice rests on a theory that is famous, influential, beautifully argued and rejected by most of the specialists. I am going to give it to you at full strength because it is one of the most interesting ideas anyone has ever had about the human mind. And then I am going to tell you exactly why the experts do not accept it. And you can decide what to do with it. That is the deal. I am not going to sell it as fact because it is not established fact, and this channel does not do that. The theory belongs to Julian Jaynes, a Princeton psychologist, who published it in 1976 in a book with a title as long as its ambition: The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. Here is the idea. Jaynes argued that self-aware consciousness, the inner mental space you take completely for granted, the private theatre where you narrate your life and know that the narrator is you, is not a biological given. It is a learned thing, a cultural invention, and a recent one. And before it was invented, humans had a different kind of mind, which he called bicameral, two-chambered. In the bicameral mind, according to Janes, one part of the brain generated commands, and the other part obeyed them. But crucially, the part that obeyed did not experience the commands as its own thoughts. It experienced them as a voice, an actual heard voice, an auditory hallucination, issuing instructions in moments of stress or decision, and that voice was attributed to a god. Bicameral people were not conscious in our sense. They did not deliberate in a private inner space. When a novel situation arose that habit could not handle, the God voice spoke, and they obeyed, the way you obey a command from outside. And Janes argued you can see this in the oldest texts. The characters in the oldest layers of the Iliad do not agonize and decide the way modern characters do. The gods simply tell them what to do, and they do it. And in Mesopotamia, the whole civilization, Janes said, ran on this. A society of people whose leaders were gods, whose managers ran the gods' estates, and who in moments of decision heard the gods and obeyed. The statues in the temples fed and clothed and spoken to as if alive. The constant divination. The personal god at your side who spoke. Janes read all of it literally. They heard voices, all of them. It was the normal architecture of the human mind. And then, he argued, it broke down. In the 2nd and 1st millennia BC, under the pressure of writing, of trade, of migration, of catastrophe, of societies growing too complex and too intermixed for the voices to keep working. And the breakdown was traumatic. The voices went silent. The gods stopped speaking, and humanity was left, for the first time, alone inside its own head, having to decide things consciously, in an interior space that had not existed before, and grieving everywhere for the voices that had gone. And here is where he reached for the exact text I already read you. My God has forsaken me and disappeared. My goddess has failed me and keeps at a distance. The good angel who walked beside me has departed. Janes read that not as depression and not as metaphor, but as literal testimony, the record of a species losing its hallucinated gods, written by people who could still remember when the voices were there and were now, catastrophically, hearing silence, and he pointed at an object. Around 1230 BC, an Assyrian king, Tukulti-Ninurta, had a stone altar carved, and the carving shows the king twice, approaching a throne and then kneeling before it. Janes says, no king before in history is shown kneeling, and the throne he kneels before is empty. There is no God on it. Janes reads that empty throne as the whole thing in a single image, the God who used to be present, used to be there, used to speak, gone. An absence where the voice used to sit, the bicameral mind carved in the moment of its breaking. It is a magnificent theory. It is one of the great intellectual swings for the fences of the 20th century. And most Assyriologists think it is wrong. I want to be as clear about this as I have been about the theory itself. The specific objections are serious. Scholars who read these languages for a living argue that Janes misreads the texts, that Lutlul is not literal testimony of lost hallucinations, but a sophisticated literary and theological work, using the language of divine abandonment the way poetry uses language, by people who are fully as conscious and self-aware as we are. A specialist at the University of Chicago has argued flatly that there is no good evidence for literal, routine voice hearing in ancient Mesopotamia, and that reading these poems as clinical reports of hallucination is a modern imposition on texts that are doing something more complex. The dating is a problem. The neuroscience Janes proposed is not well supported. And the deepest objection is methodological. It is extraordinarily hard to prove anything about the quality of ancient inner experience from written texts, because texts are conventions, and the absence of modern-sounding introspection in an old poem might mean the poets thought differently, or might just mean they wrote differently. So, not established, contested, most likely wrong in its strong form. But here is why the fifth voice earns its place on this list even so, and why I did not simply cut it. Strip away James's grand historical claim, the dating, the species-wide breakdown, the literal hallucinations, and look at what is left. Because what is left is real, and it is measurable, and it is genuinely strange. You hear a voice that makes no sound. Right now. The voice reading these words, it has no acoustic existence, no air is moving, no sound is being made, and yet you are, in some real sense, hearing it. And that is not just a figure of speech, because we can look. When people engage in inner speech, brain imaging shows activation in the auditory regions, the parts of the brain that process heard sound, and in some studies even in the earliest auditory cortex, the tissue that handles actual incoming sound. Your brain, when you talk to yourself silently, partially does the thing it does when it hears a voice out loud. There is real overlap between hearing a voice and hearing your own inner speech, and the connection to hearing voices that are not there is not fanciful. The leading neurocognitive account of auditory verbal hallucinations, the voices heard in schizophrenia and in other conditions, and by a substantial number of people with no illness at all, is that they are, in part, inner speech that has failed to be tagged as self-generated. The brain produces the inner voice, but loses the label that says this one is mine. And so it arrives as a voice from outside, a voice with no source, a voice that speaks and is not experienced as you. That is not James's theory, but it is the demonstrable core of what James was pointing at. The boundary between my inner voice and a voice I hear is not a wall. It is a tag, a neural label that says self, applied to some internally generated speech and, sometimes, not applied. When the tag is on, it is your thought. When the tag is off, it is a voice, and it can feel exactly as external as a god at your side. Let me give you James's strongest single piece of evidence, because if I'm going to have you take the theory seriously enough to then set it aside, you should see it at its most persuasive, and it is not the Mesopotamian material, it is Greek. Read the Iliad closely, James said, the oldest layers of it, and notice what is missing. There is almost no introspection. The characters do not, on the whole, sit and deliberate and decide in the way characters in a novel do. When Achilles is about to draw his sword and something stops him, it is not that he thinks better of it. It is that the goddess Athena physically arrives, grabs him by the hair and tells him not to. When a hero finds courage, a god puts it in him. When he loses it, a god takes it away. The mental events that we would narrate as internal, resolve, hesitation, a change of mind, are, in the oldest epic, externalized into gods who arrive and act on the character from outside. And the vocabulary, James pointed out, is telling. The early Greek words that later come to mean mind or soul or spirit, psyche, thumos, nous, do not, in the oldest layers, mean an inner mental space. They refer to concrete things, breath, blood, motion, activities of the body. There is no word in the oldest Greek for the private inner theatre of consciousness, because, James argued, there was no such theatre yet. The word arrives when the thing arrives, and you can watch the vocabulary of inner life get built across the centuries, from parts that originally meant something physical. That is a genuinely powerful observation, and it is the core of why the theory has never quite died despite the specialists' rejection. The oldest literature really does represent mental causation differently. Gods where we would put thoughts, external intervention where we would put decision. Something is different about how these texts render the inside of a person. The question is what that difference means. And this is where the objection lands, and it is decisive enough that I have to give it full weight. It might mean, as James wanted, that the people were literally different, that they genuinely heard voices and lacked an inner theatre, or it might mean only that the literary conventions were different, that these were poems working within inherited rules about how you represent a mind on the page, and that the absence of novelistic introspection tells you about the poetry, not about the psychology of the people who made it. We do not narrate dreams the way we narrate waking life. That does not mean we experience dreams as a different species. The gap between how a text represents inner life and how its authors actually experienced inner life is real, and it is wide, and Jane's largely walked across it as if it were not there. Most scholars think that is the fatal flaw. He read a difference in literary convention as a difference in consciousness, and those are not the same thing, and you cannot get from one to the other without more evidence than a poem can provide. That is very likely correct. I think it is correct, but notice what the objection concedes, even as it refutes him. It concedes that the oldest texts genuinely do locate the causes of action outside the self, in gods, in arriving powers, in voices, rather than inside a deliberating I. Whether that is because the people experienced it that way or only wrote it that way, the fact remains that the default, the natural mode, the thing that did not need explaining to the original audience, was that the impulse comes from outside and the person receives it. The inner I as sole author is the thing that had to be invented, or at least had to be brought to the foreground. And it was brought to the foreground in historical time in texts we can read. Whatever the mechanism, the modern sense of authoring your own thoughts is not the timeless default. It has a history. You can watch it being written. The empty throne then, whatever tukulti ninurta meant by it, points at something true. There is a seat in the human mind where a voice speaks, and whether that voice is experienced as you or as other is not fixed. It depends on a label that can be present or absent. Usually the throne has your name on it. Sometimes the name comes off, and the voice keeps speaking, and there is no one you can point to in the seat. I owe you the actual neuroscience of the empty throne, because I have been saying the tag can come off, and that deserves to be more than a phrase. The leading cognitive account of auditory verbal hallucinations, hearing a voice when no one is speaking, is built around a mechanism called self-monitoring or source monitoring. Here is the ordinary version of it, the one running correctly in most heads. When you produce an action, your brain predicts the sensory consequences of that action and uses the prediction to tag the result as self-generated. This is why you cannot tickle yourself. Your brain predicts the sensation of your own moving hand and damps it down, flags it as me, and the surprise that makes a tickle is cancelled. The same predictive system is thought to operate on inner speech. When you generate inner speech, a parallel signal, an efference copy, a prediction of the speech, lets the brain tag that inner voice as self-produced. This one is mine. I made it. It gets the label, and because it gets the label, you experience it as your own thought, rather than as a voice. The dominant account of auditory hallucination is that this tagging fails. The inner speech is generated as usual, but the self-monitoring signal that should mark it as mine is disrupted, and so the brain encounters internally generated speech with no self-label attached. And a voice with no self-label is, to the brain, a voice from outside. It is processed as external, as other, as someone speaking. The person is, in a real sense, hearing their own inner speech, but stripped of the tag that would let them recognize it as theirs. There is evidence for this beyond the theory. When people experiencing auditory hallucinations are studied, there is often activation in the same speech production and auditory regions involved in inner speech. The brain is doing the inner speech thing, but the experience is of an external voice, and the phenomenon exists on a spectrum that runs right through the general population. A substantial number of people with no diagnosis at all hear voices occasionally, and the line between vivid inner voice, an imagined voice, and a voice that seems to come from outside is not a wall but a gradient, governed by how reliably that self-tag is applied. So this is the literal machinery of the empty throne. There is a seat in the mind where inner speech is generated. There is a label, a neural signature, a predictive tag that normally gets stamped onto that speech and makes it read as yours. When the label is on, the throne has your name on it, and the voice is your thought. When the label fails, the throne is empty. The voice still speaks. The seat is still occupied by something producing language, but there is no self in the chair, and the voice arrives as other, as a presence, as a god at your side, or a stranger in the room. Jains may have been wrong that whole civilizations lived with the tag routinely off, but the tag is real, and it can be off, and when it is, a human being hears a voice that is generated inside their own head and experiences it as coming from outside themselves, attributed across most of history and most of the world to gods, spirits, ancestors, the dead. The empty throne is not a metaphor the Assyrians invented. It is a state the brain can enter, and does enter, and the Assyrians carved a picture of it. The Mesopotamians put a god there. We put a self there. And the disturbing thing that both the ancient carving and the modern neuroscience are circling is that the seat and the voice and the one who sits and speaks are not as reliably the same thing as you would like to believe. The sixth voice. The sixth voice. The sixth voice is the one that is missing. I have told you that every Mesopotamian had a personal god, and that the god's absence was catastrophe. But I need to complete that picture, because the texts are specific about the state of a person without their god, and the state they describe is not just unlucky. It is something closer to impaired. A person without a god, in the Mesopotamian understanding, was exposed, unprotected, open to the lurking things. But more than that, they were, in a sense the texts keep circling, diminished in their capacity to act well. The god was the source of good counsel, of sound judgment, of the clear thought that leads to the right decision. Without it, a person did not simply lose their luck. They lost their access to the guiding voice. They were left to navigate without the thing that, in the Mesopotamian model, did a substantial part of the navigating. To be without a god was, in part, to be unable to think as well. To have lost the interior counsel that made good action possible. They imagined, in other words, a human being with the guiding inner voice switched off, and they treated it as a grave deprivation. Here is why that matters, and this is the segment where the modern discovery is so recent that most people listening will not have heard it. There are people who have almost no inner voice, not a quiet inner voice, something closer to none. At the far low end of the range, people report that they do not narrate their lives silently to themselves, do not hear words in their head when they think, do not rehearse conversations in language or read with a voice sounding the words. The interior verbal stream that you are experiencing right now, the one reading these words, is for them faint to absent, and in many cases as far back as they can remember. I want to be careful with the strong version of this claim because it is genuinely contested. The researchers who name the condition argue some people have no inner speech at all. A commentary published the following year pushed back hard, granting that low inner speech people really do differ measurably, but arguing that the study does not prove the experience is ever truly at zero, rather than just rare or hard to notice. That argument is unresolved. What is not in dispute is that inner speech varies enormously between people, from near constant to nearly absent, and that most people had no idea the variation existed. This has a name now. The condition of lacking an inner voice was given the term anendophasia, from the Greek, roughly, no inner speech, in a study published in 2024 by the linguist Johanna Nedergaard and her colleague Gary Lupian in the journal Psychological Science. It is one of the most quietly astonishing findings in recent psychology, not because it is rare, but because of how invisible it was. Because here is the thing that should stop you. Most people did not know this was a variable at all. Almost everyone with a strong inner voice assumes that everyone has one, that the silent narrator is simply what thinking is: universal, standard equipment. And almost everyone without one assumed for their whole lives that inner voice was a figure of speech. That when other people said they talked to themselves in their head, they were speaking metaphorically, the way you might say your heart was in your throat. Neither group knew the other existed. People got to adulthood, got married, lived entire lives without discovering that the person next to them had a completely different interior, that one of them was full of words and the other was silent, and both had assumed their own condition was everyone's. The discovery went semi-viral a few years ago, precisely because of that shock. Waves of people realizing in real time, often in comment threads, that this was a real difference and landing on one side or the other of it and being genuinely destabilized by the discovery. Wait, you hear words all the time? Against wait, you don't? The research is early, and I will not overstate it. What counts as inner speech, how you measure its absence, whether it is truly absent or just differently accessed, all of that is live, and the field is young, and the 2024 study is a beginning and not a conclusion. People without a strong inner voice think perfectly well. They reason, they decide. They live full interior lives, in images, in spatial relationships, in abstract thought that does not pass through words. It is not a deficit. It is a difference. I want to be careful not to turn it into a tragedy, because it is not one, but hold it against the sixth voice. Mesopotamians imagined a person with the guiding inner voice, absent, and they marked it as a profound difference in condition, a person navigating without the interior counsel that most people had. They could not have known it was literally true. They could not have known that there are walking around human beings for whom the guiding voice in the head barely speaks or does not speak at all, and that those people mostly did not know they differed from anyone until a few years ago, and that the rest of us did not know it about them. Let me tell you what Nedegard and Lupien actually tested, because the finding is easy to state loosely, and the loose version overclaims, and the careful version is more interesting anyway. The 2024 study did not just ask people whether they had an inner voice and take their word for it. That would be nearly worthless, because people are, as we have already seen, unreliable narrators of their own inner experience. Instead, they recruited people at the two extremes, people who reported very high levels of inner speech and people who reported very low levels, the anendophasia group, and they gave both groups tasks where having a running inner voice ought to help, if it does anything at all. One was a verbal memory task. Remember a sequence of words that sound similar, which is exactly the kind of thing you would expect a person to handle by silently rehearsing the words in inner speech. Another involved judging whether two pictured things had rhyming names, again, something you would expect to do by sounding the words out internally. And the low inner speech group did measurably worse. On the memory task especially, the people who reported little or no inner voice were at a genuine disadvantage, consistent with the idea that they were not in fact silently rehearsing, because they largely do not have the mechanism that does the rehearsing. That is what makes it more than a curiosity, and more than self-report. It is a reported difference in inner experience that shows up as a difference in performance on a task measured from the outside. The absence of the inner voice is not just something people say about themselves. It has consequences you can catch in a lab. But, and Nedegard has been careful about this, and I will be too, it is not a deficit in any global sense. The anendophasia group compensated, used other strategies, and did fine on plenty of tasks. They are not less intelligent, not less capable, not living diminished inner lives. They think in other currencies, visual, spatial, abstract, something that does not reduce cleanly to words. The point is not that they are worse, the point is that the inner voice, which most people who have one assume is simply identical to thinking, is not thinking. It is one tool for thinking, and the thinking goes on fine without it, which means the voice and the thinker are not the same thing. And that is the fact that detonates the seventh voice, so hold on to it. If a human being can think, reason, decide, remember, plan, live a full interior life, with the inner voice switched entirely off, then the inner voice is not the one doing the thinking. It is a narration of thinking that happens somewhere else, by some process that does not need words and does not need the voice, and was never the voice in the first place. There is a further layer to the minds without a voice finding, and it complicates the whole picture in a way I want to give you honestly, because it is easy to hear all of this as inner speech is the self, and that is exactly wrong. Inner speech is not the only inner medium, it is one of several. When Hurlbert's beeper method actually samples inner experience, inner speech, words in the head, is only one of the things that shows up, and it does not show up as often as people assume. Other common phenomena include inner seeing, visual imagery, picturing things, running a scene in the mind's eye, and feelings that are present in awareness without words, and what he calls unsymbolized thinking. This is the strange one. A thought that is definitely present, definitely has specific content, is definitely being thought, but involves no words and no images at all. A thought you're having, fully, with nothing you could point to as its material. People report it constantly, once they are trained to notice, and it undoes the assumption that a thought has to be made of something you can observe. So the population is not divided cleanly into has an inner voice and has nothing. It is divided across a whole set of inner modalities, in different proportions, in different people. Some people are flooded with inner speech and rarely picture anything. Some people think in vivid images and have little inner speech. Some people report a great deal of unsymbolized thinking, content without medium. Some have vivid inner speech and imagery. And there are people at the far end of the visual axis too, people with aphantasia who cannot voluntarily picture anything at all. No mind's eye, who discovered this about themselves recently and with the same shock as the no inner voice group. Here is why that matters, and why it makes the seventh voice's case stronger rather than weaker. Every one of these people thinks. The aphantasic who cannot picture anything reasons perfectly. The anendophasic who has no inner voice reasons perfectly. The person full of unsymbolized thought, content with no medium at all, is thinking, obviously, with nothing you could hold up as the thought, which means the thinking is not identical to any of its displays, not the voice, not the image, not the feeling. All of those are the ways thought gets presented to awareness, the formats it surfaces in, which vary from person to person, and the actual thinking, the process that produces them, is none of them and runs underneath all of them, out of view, generating whichever display your particular mind happens to use. The voice is a monitor, so is the mind's eye, so is the wordless knowing. They are output devices, showing you a readout of a process that is happening somewhere you cannot observe, in a currency that is not any of the readouts. And the proof is that you can remove any given readout, the voice, the image, and the process keeps running, and the answers keep coming, in whatever format is left. You are not the voice. You already knew that from the people who have no voice. But you are not the images, either, or the feelings, or the wordless thoughts. You are downstream of all of them, the one they are all being shown to. And here is a small finding that turns the knife, because it is about the exact thing you're doing at this moment. When researchers sample how people read, when they actually ask at random moments what is happening in the mind of someone with a book, they find that the inner voice, while reading, is not uniform, and it is not universal, and it does something you would not expect. Many people, reading fiction, report that the characters have distinct voices in their heads, that different characters sound different, in accent, in pitch, in pace, without the reader choosing to make them so. The voices assign themselves. A character speaks on the page, and a voice you did not design arrives to speak the line, already characterized, already particular. Where did that voice come from? You did not build it. You did not sit and engineer an accent for a character. The text supplied words and something in you, below the level of choice, automatically, instantly, supplied a voice to say them in. A voice with properties you did not select and could not fully predict. Readers report being surprised by their own character voices, being unable to change them once they have set. Having a character sound wrong when the audiobook narrator does not match the voice their own mind had already, unbidden, assigned. That is the seventh voice in miniature, happening every time you read a novel. Voices arrive in your head, fully formed, to say words you did not write, in tones you did not choose, and you experience them as simply appearing, because they do. The machinery that reads to you is not taking your instructions. It is doing the reading, in voices of its own devising, and presenting the performance to you, the audience, who mistakes having been read to for having done the reading. You are right now being read to by a voice you did not choose. If a character spoke in this sentence, a voice would arrive to say their line, and it would not ask you first. And what they are showing you is the output of something you have never once directly observed and never will. The voice is a display. The work is done backstage by something you cannot hear, and the voice reports it to you after the fact, in words, if you happen to be a person who has the voice at all. They said, there are people that God does not speak to. There are. We just found them. They are about to be the reason the seventh voice is so hard to think about. Because if the voice in the head can simply be absent, in a person who functions perfectly, then the voice is not the thinker. The voice is not you. It is something the mind produces or does not produce. And either way, the thinking goes on. Which raises the only question left. If the voice is not you, then whose is it? The seventh voice, the one they said was never yours. Come all the way back to the beginning, the voice reading these words. I asked you at the start whose it was, and I said the Sumerians had an answer, and that the seventh answer was the one that should keep you up. Here it is. In the Mesopotamian account, the most important voice in your head was never yours to begin with. The personal God, the guide, the first voice, the one whose departure was catastrophe and whose counsel was the source of good judgment, was not experienced as a part of the self. That is the entire point of it. When the good idea arrived, it was not you having a good idea, it was the God speaking. The guidance came from outside the self, entered, and was received. The best of your thinking, the clearest, the wisest, the most surprising, the thoughts that seemed to come from somewhere better than your ordinary mind. Those specifically were the ones you did not author. They were given. The voice that mattered most was, by definition, the one that was not you. We find that absurd. We are certain our thoughts are ours. We generate them, we own them. The whole edifice of the modern self is built on the assumption that behind every thought there is an I who thought it deliberately and is responsible for it. So let me ask you to do one thing, and it is the only thing this whole video has been building toward. Predict your next thought, not react to it after it arrives. Predict it. Say in advance what the next thought to appear in your mind will be before it appears. You cannot. Nobody can. It is not a limitation of effort or attention. It is structural and it is total. Thoughts arrive. They present themselves, already formed, in your inner voice, and the very first moment you know what the thought is the moment it is already there. You do not compose your thoughts word by word in some prior workshop and then release them into awareness. They surface, finished. From somewhere you cannot see into by a process you have no access to, and the you that supposedly authored them meets them at exactly the same instant a listener would. Watch it happen. Sit quietly and observe your own thinking, and what you will find, what every contemplative tradition that ever looked has found, is that thoughts occur. They are not manufactured by a visible you. They appear the way sounds appear, The way the next line of a song you are not choosing appears. The sense that you are the author, deliberately generating each thought, does not survive 30 seconds of actually watching. The author is nowhere to be found. There is thinking, and there is a voice, and there is the strong feeling of ownership stamped onto it after the fact. But the ownership is a tag, as we saw, a label applied to speech the mind generated on its own. And the speech was generated before you knew what it would say. Your thoughts arrive from a source you cannot observe, already complete, and announce themselves in a voice you did not consciously start. You do not know what you are about to think until you're thinking it. In what sense exactly? Is that yours? Let me give you the most trivial and the most damning proof of the seventh voice, because it is one you have experienced 1,000 times and never counted as evidence. The song stuck in your head, the earworm, the fragment of music that arrives, uninvited, and plays and loops and will not stop when you tell it to. Almost everyone gets them. They can run for hours. They are, by the accounts of the people who have them, genuinely involuntary. You do not choose the song, you cannot choose the song, and when you try to force it out, another one often takes its place. Now look at what that actually is, because we are so used to it that we have stopped finding it strange. There is a voice in your head, a full auditory experience, melody, words, the timbre of the singer, that you did not start, cannot stop, did not choose, and do not want. It is generated inside your own mind, using your own auditory machinery, and it runs against your will, and the you that wants it to stop is completely unable to make it stop. The earworm is inner experience that is unmistakably not under the control of the self, generated by the self's own equipment, arriving and persisting entirely on its own terms. If you can have a song in your head that you did not choose and cannot stop, and you can, and you have, then the principle is already conceded. The inside of your head is not under your command. It generates content on its own. It delivers it to you whether you want it or not, and continues against your explicit wish. The earworm is the seventh voice wearing its most harmless costume, proof available to almost everyone, on demand, that the voice in the head does not belong to the one who hears it. The Mesopotamians would not have been puzzled by the earworm for 1 second. Of course there is sound in your head that you did not put there and cannot remove. Of course the inside of a person is not under that person's sole command. That was their entire model. It is only our model, the one unified owner in full control of the contents of his own mind, that has to pretend the stuck song is a curiosity rather than a refutation. It is a refutation. You have simply been taught not to count it. There is a way to feel this directly, and I want to give it to you before I let you go, because the argument is one thing and the experience is another, and the experience is the thing that stays. You have had the sensation of a word being on the tip of your tongue. You know exactly the thing you mean. You can feel the shape of the word. You know it starts with a certain sound, and it will not come. And then often, minutes later, when you have stopped trying, it arrives. It surfaces on its own, complete, and presents itself. Where was it? In the interval, while you were reaching for it and it would not come, the word existed somewhere in you. It had to. You recognized it the instant it arrived, which means it was already there to be matched against. It was being searched for and found and readied and delivered by machinery you had no access to, that you could not observe, that you could not hurry, and that handed you the finished result at a moment of its own choosing, not yours. That is not an unusual case. That is every thought. The tip of the tongue state is just the ordinary process slowed down enough that you can see it, the reaching, the retrieval happening out of sight, the finished delivery. Normally it is fast enough that the retrieval is invisible, and the thought seems to simply be yours, generated by you on demand. But it is always the tip of the tongue process. Every word you have ever spoken or thought was fetched from somewhere you cannot see, by something you did not consciously direct, and delivered to you complete. You are not the author, you are the audience. You are the one the thoughts are delivered to, and the delivery is so fast and so smooth that you mistake receiving them for making them. Now put that beside the Mesopotamian claim one final time, at full strength. They said the best of your thoughts are not yours, that they come from a source at your side that you cannot see, that they arrive as something given, and that the honest response is to receive them as a gift rather than to claim them as a product. They personified the source and called it a god, and we are confident they were wrong to personify it. And maybe they were. But the structural claim underneath the personification, that thought arrives, finished, from a source outside the observing self, and that calling it mine is a story laid over the top of that arrival. That claim is not superstition. That is what introspection finds when it looks carefully. That is what the tip of the tongue state shows you in slow motion. That is what a mind without an inner voice proves by thinking fine without one. That is what the failure of self-tagging reveals when the same voice becomes a hallucination the moment the label falls off. They looked at the arrival of thought from the unseen, and they did not pretend to be its author. We looked at the same arrival, and we could not stand not to be. So we told a story in which a unified I generates every thought on purpose, and we believe the story so completely that the ancient view looks insane to us. But you just tried to predict your next thought and could not. You have felt a word withheld and then delivered by a hand that was not yours. You have listened this whole time to a voice you did not start. Ask yourself which of you is telling the story and which is telling the truth. The Mesopotamians looked at that same fact, the arrival of thought from an unseen source, finished, feeling given, and they drew the honest conclusion. They said, "This is not coming from me. The good thought, the guiding voice, the counsel that arrives from beyond my ordinary self, that is not mine. Something else is speaking, and I am receiving it, and the wisest thing I can do is listen." We looked at the same fact and could not bear that conclusion, so we buried it. We insisted on ownership. We stamped self onto the whole process, including the parts that plainly arrive from outside any self we can locate. Because the alternative, that the voice in your head is not, in the deepest sense, yours, is intolerable to the story we have been told about what we are. But it is there in the machinery, the tag that says mine can come off, and then the same voice is a hallucination. The voice can be absent entirely in people who think without it, and the voice, when it is present, speaks words you did not choose in advance and could not have predicted. Words that arrive from precisely the place the Mesopotamians pointed at when they looked inward and did not see a single unified owner, but a guide and a god, and a voice that came from somewhere that was not the self. They were not being primitive. They were being accurate. They reported the interior as they found it, crowded, given, arriving from beyond the eye, and then, because they were honest, they did not pretend the eye was in charge of what it did not author. There is one more group of people who looked hard at the seventh voice, and they are not ancient and not scientists, and I want to bring them in because they ran the experiment on themselves for thousands of years and reported back with remarkable consistency. The contemplatives, the meditators, the people from a dozen unconnected traditions who sat down deliberately and did nothing but watch their own minds for long periods, and who came back again and again across cultures that had never met with the same report. The report is this: when you watch closely enough, the author disappears. Sit and attend to your own thinking without engaging it. Just watch the thoughts arrive. And the first thing you notice is that they arrive. You are not making them. They appear, the way sounds appear, unbidden, from a silence, and pass. And the longer you watch, the harder it becomes to locate the one who is supposedly producing them. You look for the thinker behind the thoughts, and you find only more thoughts. You look for the self that is having the experience, and you find only the experience. The I that was supposed to be sitting at the center, authoring everything, turns out to be impossible to find when you actually go looking. It keeps turning out to be just another thought that arose, claiming ownership of the others after the fact. Every serious introspective tradition that ever ran this experiment landed near the same place. The Buddhist traditions built an entire psychology on it. The observation that there is no findable permanent self behind experience, only arising and passing events. Thoughts among them, with the sense of a unified owner being one more event rather than the ground beneath them. Contemplatives in other traditions, using completely different vocabularies, described the same dissolution of the author under sustained attention. They were not theorizing. They were reporting what sustained, careful first-person observation actually finds, and what it finds is that the thing you cannot find is precisely the sole, unified, deliberate authoring self that the modern story insists is doing everything. Now line them all up, because they're pointing at one thing from 4 directions. The Mesopotamians, looking inward without our assumptions, reported that the guiding voice comes from outside the self and is received, not authored. The contemplatives, watching the mind for millennia, reported that the author cannot be found, and the thoughts simply arise. The neuroscientists, with their scanners, found that the sense of ownership is a tag, a label applied after generation, one that can fail, one that some minds apply differently, and some barely apply at all. And the people with no inner voice demonstrated that the thinking proceeds regardless of whether there is a voice to narrate it, which means the narrator was never the thinker. 4 witnesses, ancient scribes, silent meditators, brain scientists, and people who think without words. None of them talking to each other, all of them reporting that the unified self, who deliberately authors every thought, the one you've been told you are, cannot be located, and that thought arrives, finished, from somewhere the observing self does not reach. The Mesopotamians were the first of the 4 to write it down. They lacked the scanner and the laboratory and the vocabulary. What they had was the willingness to report the inside of a human being as they actually found it, crowded, given, spoken to by voices that did not feel like the self, instead of as the tidy story insisted it must be. And what they found 4,000 years ago is holding up. We tell a cleaner story, one voice, one owner, all mine, fully in control. You just tried to predict your next thought and could not. You have spent this entire video listening to a voice in your head that you did not start and cannot stop. Ask yourself honestly, which account fits the thing you're actually experiencing right now? The 7th voice is the one that isn't yours. It is the one reading this sentence. Let me set it down plainly, the way I have at the end of everything on this channel, because after all of that you are owed the flat version. The oldest people who wrote looked inward and did not see what you have been told to see. They did not see one self, unified, in charge, generating its own thoughts. They saw many voices, a guide who was a parent, the same guide departing, in a lament that describes depression better than our own word for it, a god and a goddess, the hard voice and the soft, arguing, which is the dialogue we now know inner speech to be, a lurking accuser that entered at the threshold, which is the inner critic and the intrusive thought, a voice on an empty throne, which is the fragile tag that decides whether inner speech feels like you or like someone else, people the voice does not speak to, who turn out to be real, and who mostly did not know it about themselves until a few years ago. And underneath all of it, the voice that was never yours, the one that arrives from a place you cannot see, finished in words you could not have predicted. Every scientific claim in this is published, and I have told you where it stands. The personal god and goddess, the Rabasu, the departure in Ludlul, solid, mainstream, not in dispute. Vygotsky, the dialogic inner voice, the auditory cortex, and endophasia, the self-tagging account of hallucination, all real, all published, all cited. And the one contested piece, Jane's and his bicameral mind, I flagged as contested the entire way through, and gave you the specialist's objections, and did not ask you to believe it, because it is not established, and you deserve better than to be handed a theory dressed as a fact. And after you strip out everything uncertain, after you throw out Janes's grand claim, and keep only what is solid, this is what remains. 4,000 years ago, the first people who could write anything down reported that the voice in the human head is not simply the self talking, that it comes in part from outside the eye, that it can guide you, or leave you, or accuse you, or fall silent, or split into two, and that the wisest response is to stop pretending you are the sole author of what appears in your own mind. We called that superstition and built a tidier story. Then we invented instruments and looked and found. The inner voice is an internalized other. It is dialogic, not single. It runs on a tag that says self, and the tag can fail. It is absent entirely in people who function without it, and it produces thoughts you cannot predict a single instant before they arrive. Everything they said about the voice, we are slowly confirming, minus the gods. I want to give you the frame that ties all seven together, because there is one, and it is the most important idea in the theory of the mind right now, and it turns the whole video from a series of coincidences into a single claim. It is called predictive processing, and the core of it is a reversal of how we naturally assume perception works. You assume you perceive the world by taking it in. Light hits your eye, sound hits your ear, the information flows inward, and your brain assembles it into experience. Input first, experience second. Predictive processing says it runs, to a startling degree, the other way. Your brain is not primarily receiving the world, it is primarily predicting the world, running a constant, detailed model of what is about to be out there and what is about to happen next. And what actually reaches your senses is used mainly to correct the prediction where it is wrong. You do not see with your eyes and hear with your ears so much as you generate a controlled hallucination of the world and check it against the incoming signal. Perception is prediction, edited by reality. And thought is the same machinery, turned inward. Your brain is a prediction engine, constantly generating the next state, the next percept, the next word, the next thought from its model before the evidence is in. That is why you can finish other people's sentences. That is why the tip of the tongue word arrives on its own. That is why you cannot predict your next thought. The machinery that would do the predicting is the machinery that produces the thought. So the thought and its prediction are the same event, and it is finished the instant it exists. And now every voice on this list is one mechanism seen from a different angle. The guiding voice that arrives as given, that is the prediction engine delivering its output, which by construction arrives finished, from a level below awareness. The self-tag that says mine and can fail, that is the same predictive machinery modelling its own products and labelling the ones it predicted as self-generated, exactly the tickle mechanism. And hallucination is that labelling gone wrong. The inner voice as internalised other, that is the model built from other people, because the model is built from everything, and the people who raised you are the largest thing in it. The dialogue, the two sides, that is the model running competing predictions and weighing them. And the thing you cannot find when you look for the author. You cannot find it because it is not a thing, it is a process, distributed, sub-personal, running underneath the awareness it generates. And awareness only ever sees the finished output, never the machine. The Mesopotamians did not have predictive processing. They had a floodplain, a stylus, and the willingness to report the inside of a person as they found it. And what they found and wrote down was a mind that is crowded, that speaks to itself in more than one voice, that receives its best thoughts as gifts from a source it cannot see, that can be abandoned by its own guiding voice, that has its ownership of its thoughts fail and turn them into others, and that is never, at bottom, the single unified author it takes itself to be. They called the source of it gods, we call it the predictive brain. They are describing the same thing, the fact that you're not the one writing your thoughts, you're the one they're read to, and the reader is not the author. That is the whole of it. That is what they knew, in their vocabulary, 4,000 years before we worked out ours. And maybe the gods were only ever their word for the thing we still do not have a word for. The fact that the voice in your head arrives from somewhere you cannot see, saying things you did not choose, and that calling it yours is the story, not the observation. The tablets are in the museums. Most of them have never been read. The one that describes the departing voice has been sitting in translation in the open for over a century, describing a state every person listening to this has been in or will be. There is a voice in your head. It has been reading these words to you the entire time. You still do not know whose it is.